Happy Monday, everybody, and I'm glad that you could join me today, and welcome to the inaugural edition of the Southern Conservative Podcast. First, a little bit about the podcast before we get into today's talk. This podcast will be brought to you Monday through Thursday, at least that's the plan. Each podcast will be roughly 30 minutes long. I'll try not to make it any longer than that. I'm sure that you don't want to listen to a podcast any longer than a half hour. Some days it's going to be shorter. Some days I'll just briefly touch on some topics. But the topics will include current events, history, conservatism. We'll embrace conservative principles discussing limited government, individualism, liberty, freedom, and constitutionalism. We'll discuss the founding principles that have made America the best country on earth in a matter of about 2.5 centuries. Now, a little bit about myself. My name is Ty. I'll be 29 years old next month. I'm a pharmacist. I've been a pharmacist for 4 years now. And I consider myself to be successful in having achieved the American dream, but like many of you out there, I continue to want to climb the ladder of success. I continue to strive to better myself, just as many of you out there, I'm sure, continue to strive to better yourselves. I moved to South Carolina in 2016, and if you live in South Carolina, I came down about 2 weeks before Hurricane Matthew came rolling through. So that was a great big welcome to South Carolina right there. I lived in Maryland for 27 years. And as you know, Maryland is certainly a very big liberal haven in the Mid-Atlantic. And at times I'll talk about the politics of Maryland. I'm very familiar with the politics in that state. And I understand the politics in that state and how sometimes things that happen in Maryland eventually translate to the national stage. And how sometimes things on the national stage cause Maryland to implement new liberal ideas. And seeing as how liberalism is the antithesis of conservatism, we'll talk about some things going on in Maryland. Most of my family still lives in Maryland, in the Mid-Atlantic area, in West Virginia, Pennsylvania. I have family spread all throughout this country. And at times I'll talk about Maryland politics just to capture their attention, if you will. But today I want to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today is Martin Luther King Day. And this year it's a very special one. Because coming up on April 4th, we will mark 50 years since the assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis, Tennessee by James Earl Ray. And I want you to think about Martin Luther King throughout this podcast. I want you to think about what he would think of race relations today. How would he tackle racial divisions? And would he approve of the approaches that lawmakers and others are taking today to improve race relations? Now, right now, I want to play a part of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which he gave on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on August 28th, 1963.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."
Now, Dr. King was a holy man. He was a minister. He was a leading voice for equality between whites and blacks. He commonly invoked God. He had a positive message at a time when there was true systemic racism in America, and in particular, down here in the southern states. But who were the ones who implemented racism, segregationist policies, Jim Crow laws? Who was Martin Luther King directing his message to, besides the broader audience of all Americans? He was talking about Southern white Democrats. After Reconstruction, Southern white Democrats are the ones who implemented Jim Crow laws to disenfranchise blacks. They implemented poll taxes, literacy tests, to keep blacks from voting, and in many cases, poor whites from voting as well. After the Plessy versus Ferguson decision by the Supreme Court in 1896, one of the worst decisions to be handed down by that court ever in the history of the United States, the court said separate but equal is equal. And so we had the creation of separate facilities for whites and blacks. Schools, restroom facilities, drinking fountains, entrances to public buildings. But these facilities, accommodations, and so on, they were not equal, especially as time progressed. The decision was later reversed in 1954 by Brown versus Board of Education. And speaking of education, I want to discuss with you two big education cases that took place in the South during the Civil Rights era. In 1957, Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, then Governor Orville Faubus, a Democrat, used the Arkansas National Guard to prevent 9 African American high school students from attending Little Rock Central High School. This led to a showdown with President Dwight Eisenhower in which he federalized the National Guard to protect those students. Now, that speech I just played, part of the I Have a Dream speech by Dr. King, he referenced the governor of Alabama. Well, the governor of the time, in 1963, was Democrat George Wallace, a prominent segregation leader during the Civil Rights era. Now, I'm going to play for you part of Governor Wallace's inaugural address that he gave in Montgomery, Alabama on January 14, 1963, just 7 months before Martin Luther King's speech in Washington, D.C. This is probably the most memorable portion of the speech given by Governor Wallace, and it certainly influenced his decisions as governor, and it was one of the things that helped thrust him to the national stage.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Now, George Wallace later in life would go on to regret the remarks that he made in that speech. But when you speak of Jefferson Davis, the president of the former Confederacy, when you speak of Alabama's history in the Confederacy, when you say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, that's pretty despicable, at least looking at it in 2018. But this was something that was common thought in Alabama and throughout the South in the 1960s. On June 11, 1963, Governor Wallace would stand in the doorway of Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, preventing 2 African American students from completing their registration to attend school there. President Kennedy had to federalize the Alabama National Guard, after which Wallace briefly spoke and then walked away from the doorway, allowing the students to enter the school building. That event there was widely publicized and recorded, and definitely helped to make George Wallace a national figure. George Wallace would go on to run for president 3 times. In 1964 and in 1972, he would run as a Democrat candidate but he ran as a third-party candidate running under the American Independent Party in the 1968 presidential election. Now, normally we don't spend a lot of time talking about third-party candidates, especially in presidential elections, because they never win any electoral votes. But 1968 was different, and it was the last presidential election in which a third-party candidate would receive electoral college votes. In 1968, the election between Richard Nixon, the Republican, and Hubert Humphrey, the Democrat, George Wallace received 46 electoral votes, all from southern states: Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and he also received a vote from a faithless elector from North Carolina, a state won by Richard Nixon. Now, this is a very, very brief history of Democrats trying to keep segregation alive in the South during the Civil Rights era. But I want to talk about one more event, because the events that happened on this day that I'm going to talk about, this man is certainly involved in national politics today, and he represents the state of Georgia in the Congress. Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. Marchers were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, as they were marching from that city to Montgomery, Alabama. One of those who were attacked, Congressman John Lewis of Georgia. The man was nearly beaten to death. John Lewis said on Friday that he will not be attending President Trump's State of the Union address. He's not going to attend because of comments that the president recently made about Haiti, El Salvador, calling these countries S-hole countries. Now, the media has run wild with this all weekend long. You have people on the left saying that this proves that Donald Trump is racist, that we're never going to get anywhere with immigration in this country as long as Trump has those sorts of views. But we all know what Donald Trump was talking about, and certainly Democrats have a history of being on record talking about immigrants coming from poor and impoverished countries, war-torn countries. They talk about refugees coming to America and other immigrants from these poor countries coming to America. We know what Donald Trump meant, and it's still disputed whether the president even said those words. You have David Perdue and Tom Cotton, two senators who were in this closed-door meeting. They say they didn't hear the president. Lindsey Graham says he heard it. And of course, Dick Durbin said that he heard it. And there's no doubt in my mind that Dick Durbin is the one who leaked this story to the Washington Post. John Lewis said on Friday, "At this junction, I do not plan to attend the State of the Union. I cannot, in all good conscience, be in a room with what he has said about so many Americans. I just cannot do it. I wouldn't be honest with myself." Now, again, we know what Donald Trump meant, but even before these supposed comments made by the president, John Lewis has had problems with President Donald Trump. Last month, Trump attended the opening of a civil rights museum in Mississippi, and John Lewis skipped out on the event simply because President Donald Trump was going to be there. He said at the time, "President Trump's attendance and his hurtful policies are an insult to the people portrayed in the Civil Rights Museum. The struggles represented in this museum exemplify the truth of what really happened in Mississippi. President Trump's disparaging comments about women, the disabled, immigrants, the National Football League players disrespect the efforts of Fannie Lou Hamer, Aaron Henry, and others who have given their all for Mississippi to be a better place." Now, I find it interesting, folks, and I'm sure you do as well, that the party that African Americans vote for, the party that African Americans in the Congress mostly identify with, is the Democrat Party, the same party that Martin Luther King was protesting. Southern whites in the Democrat Party were the ones who implemented Jim Crow, the ones who tried to keep segregation alive in the South. And yet, because it was Lyndon Johnson who signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, they herald this man as a champion for African Americans, and African Americans have been voting Democrat ever since. But I could go on about the history of Lyndon Johnson and his time as a senator from Texas, in which he failed to vote for previous civil rights acts before he was president of the United States. And there are others who have spoken out about Trump and say they will not be attending the State of the Union address. Maxine Waters says that she's skipping out. Frederica Wilson, in her cowboy hat, the Florida congresswoman, she says that she's skipping the speech. But there's nothing in my mind that Trump has done that has made him a racist. Quite the contrary. Again, we all know the S-hole comment that he was talking about, and again, I'm not getting into that. We've heard this nonstop from the media all weekend. But you look at some of the people in his administration. Dr. Ben Carson heads up housing and urban development. He's an African American. Nikki Haley, former governor of this wonderful state of South Carolina, she's the UN ambassador. She's an Indian American. Donald Trump has family members who are Jewish. Many times Donald Trump has had to denounce support of David Duke, a white supremacist, despite David Duke supporting President Donald Trump. The president campaigned countless times all across this country, campaigning for African Americans plagued in failing inner cities like Baltimore, Detroit, and St. Louis. Just to give you an interesting statistic, 343 homicides recorded in Baltimore City, Maryland in 2017, a new record per capita murder rate for that city. Now you look at John Lewis, you look at these other congressmen and women, and you look back at Dr. Martin Luther King's speech where he says that he has a dream where little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. He had a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Martin Luther King kept fighting against segregation. Despite the abuse, despite being jailed, despite those in power who still wished for the continuation of segregation across America. And yet you have a president who, in the eyes of some, are seen as a racist, but don't want to work with the president to heal racial relations between whites and blacks. You have groups like Black Lives Matter protesting racial injustice by white police officers as if there is systemic racism on their part, when in reality it couldn't be further from the truth. Assuming that white police officers are judging people by the color of their skin and not the content of their character or their behavior or their illegality is a gross mischaracterization of the police in this country. You look at different cases that happened during the Obama administration, and it's no wonder that the exploitation of these cases by some has caused racial relations between whites and blacks to go downhill in the last several years. Michael Brown robbed a convenience store in Ferguson, Missouri. He was confronted by a police officer, Darren Wilson. Michael Brown tried to grab Wilson's gun, at which point Officer Wilson shot Michael Brown. Michael Brown retreated and then ran back toward the cop, in which he was fatally shot. But he wasn't shot because he was black. He was shot because of his behavior from robbing a convenience store, from trying to get a cop's gun and failing to cooperate with a police officer. Trayvon Martin was killed after he was beating George Zimmerman's head into a concrete sidewalk. George Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin in self-defense, and he was found not guilty in the murder of Trayvon Martin. Now, George Zimmerman was a neighborhood crime watcher who was dealing with suspicious behavior in the past. Now, you could argue that George Zimmerman discriminately targeted Trayvon Martin because he was black. But this kid took it upon himself to beat George Zimmerman. And frankly, if George Zimmerman didn't have that gun, he would probably be a dead man today. Trayvon Martin also had a history of marijuana use. Now, that may have clouded his judgment. We really don't know. Trayvon Martin's not here to tell his side of the story. But George Zimmerman was found not guilty by a jury of his peers. You look at the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore in 2015. He was arrested after fleeing police, was later found to have an illegal knife in his possession. He sustained a spinal cord injury while being transported to a police station, an injury that would later kill him. It led to civil unrest in that city. They had violent protests and rioting. Businesses were looted, property damaged, things set on fire. 6 police officers were charged with the death of Freddie Gray. And after several officers were found not guilty by Judge Barry Williams, a black man, charges against some of the other officers were dropped after it was pretty clear that none of the officers were going to be found guilty. Now, when there are cases of inappropriate, excessive, or lethal force, officers in those instances need to be dealt with appropriately. They need to be prosecuted. But these are the vast, vast minority of officers and police encounters in this country. The problem that we see in these inner cities is that they're plagued with poverty, gangs, drugs, unemployment, and so on. Under President Trump, African American unemployment rate is now at a record low. But by and large, the problems in these cities need to be dealt with at the local level. There's only so much that President Trump can do from the White House. There's only so much the federal government can do. It has to come from within these cities if these cities are ever going to solve their own problems. We are continuing to see a decline in the population of cities like Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, once 3 very thriving cities. Those who have the means to get out of these cities have done so, but those who are trapped in drugs, crime, violence, poverty, unemployment, they're stuck in this never-ending cycle. And if you look, it's no reason why these 3 cities are continuing to be in decline. These cities have seen the same party in power for many, many years, and it's been under Democratic control. You look at Baltimore, Maryland. That city hasn't had a Republican mayor since January 1st, 1967. Detroit hasn't had a Republican mayor since January 1962. St. Louis has not had a Republican mayor in that city since April of 1949. Almost 70 years of unfettered Democratic control in that city. And you sit back and you wonder why these cities aren't changing, why these cities are continuing to be in decline. You remember Trump campaigned on behalf of African Americans, and he would conclude by saying, what do you have to lose? What do you have to lose by voting for a different party? Now, if anything, we need to help our next generation. We need to change these cities. But to do that, we need to come together as whites and blacks, just as MLK said. We certainly have made great strides in this country. We no longer have segregated institutions and facilities, but there still are struggles that have been made worse in recent years. But we need cooperation on both sides. When you look at John Lewis, Maxine Waters, and others who are not going to attend the State of the Union address on January 30th, they're not attending because they disagree with the politics of Trump. They're not attending because they think he's not worthy to be commander-in-chief. They think he's a reprobate. That doesn't solve the problem. That doesn't solve the problem. If the problem is going to be solved, we need to do exactly what Martin Luther King said. We need to come together as whites and blacks. When you have one party who's refusing to cooperate with the president, how are you ever going to improve relations between whites and blacks? Now, we can disagree over whether what Trump said was appropriate, whether it wasn't appropriate. Frankly, I feel it's Trump just being Trump. And again, we all know what the president meant by the S-hole comment, right? He's characterizing certain countries really as what they are. You look at Haiti, you look at El Salvador, you look at some of these African countries, some of these countries in Southeast Asia that are very poor, poverty-stricken, unstable governments. These are the poorest of the poor third world countries on earth. And it's no wonder why people immigrate from those countries to the United States of America. It's because they're escaping the S-hole from where they came from. So in that respect, the president is absolutely right. But those aren't racist comments. And I've demonstrated how Donald Trump is not a racist. In fact, he has yet to do anything in my eyes that would make him a racist. But at the end of the day, all of us need to come together, including the President of the United States, and we need to focus on improving race relations in this country and do what we can to make this country a better place for all, so that we can live out and continue to live out the ideals and the promise in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that of the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I thank you, and I hope to join you tomorrow. For those of you who haven't checked out my Facebook page, you can certainly do so at facebook.com/Southern Conservative. That's facebook.com/Southern Conservative. And you can find links to various articles of interest that I post daily on my Facebook page. And you can certainly find each podcast on that Facebook page as well. God bless you all. I look forward to being back with you tomorrow.